Hello, my name is Sean Blacker, and I'm a psychology major with a minor in gender studies, and my project's on heteronormativity, sexuality, and intersectionality. So, I want to further explore heteronormativity and how it affects people of different sexualities, mainly gay people as well as lesbians, because with heteronormativity it mainly highlights heterosexuality and homosexuality. And of course, within that intersectionality, within further, there is the intersectionality of gender and race that changes the experience of heteronormativity. So this is just my infographic. The top left corner is just a quick summary of what heteronormativity really represents: homophobia, homophobic ideas, transphobic ideas, sexist ideas, racist ideas, and overall just hateful ideas. And then below that is contact information for a few of the groups that are fighting heteronormativity through LGBT plus activism, feminism activism, and equality activism against racism. And I also provide UNG counseling information, suicide hotline as well. And on the right is just the order of things I'm going to go through in this PowerPoint, so you can see a summary, headings if you want to take notes or anything like that. So let's start with heteronormativity and how it became to what it is today. Heteronormativity, the word, did not exist until the 1990s. Of course, the concept was already being created and stuff, but it wasn't a coined term until the 1990s. Like, homosexual and heterosexual sexuality were always a thing, but they weren't coined as terms until the 1890s. Specifically in 1892 was one of the first written uses of the words homosexual and heterosexual by Dr. James Kieran. And then the first time it appeared in the New York Times was in 1930. So with these ideas, it promoted that binary between the heterosexual ideas and homosexual ideas. And even before these terms were coined, homosexual and heterosexual behaviors were acceptable in early civilizations like ancient Greeks and Victorian era. Specifically in the Victorian era, it mainly friendships. So what I mean by that is it was okay for a guy to kiss a guy in a friendly way. It was okay for them to show affection to each other because you had to properly court a woman back in that day, in time where the men had to do certain things, so there was a lot of separation, so a lot of affections were shown between the same sexes. And then the heteronormative enforces that heterosexuality is what normal, and heterosexual is what normal, and homosexuality is what's wrong and seen different. And of course, the problem with that is to create a lot of discrimination and oppression of sexuality, specifically gay men and lesbian women. Because heteronormativity is very much enforcing a binary of homosexual versus heterosexual. It doesn't really see the whole spectrum of sexualities. It narrows it down to you're either gay or straight and nothing more. Of course, these ideologies really became prominent after World War II, when sex became known as just for procreation and nothing more. It can't be for fun or anything like that. It was for procreation, as well as the Christian Bible started to include homosexuality in the written text as a sin. So this created a hateful culture towards anyone who was LGBT plus. And of course, there was also a counterculture that slowly rose with this, and that became really prominent in the 1960s with LGBT plus activism and feminism. And then how it affects us modern today. It's of course still around, not as prominent, thank God. We're working more and more with education and mindfulness to get rid of this. But some families still enforce heteronormativity. Like, it can be something as simple as blue is for boys, and then pink is for girls, and guys play outside and do all these physical things while women do cooking and cleaning and stuff like that. And of course, there's also the thing I like to call the straight man's gay hypocrisy, where they ridicule gay men and showing affection to just their friends and considering it as gay, and creating these homophobic ideas why they fetishize lesbian women for showing, or just or girls being friends with their girls and showing affection to their friends. So like a kiss on the cheek or stuff like that, they will fetishize that. And of course, the heteronormative really does impact us every day with the clothes we wear, because only girls can wear dresses and skirts, and then guys are supposed to wear more masculine clothing. Of course, it goes into our politics as well, because our politics is very much polarized. So more liberal people see sexuality and heteronormativity as they see sexuality as a spectrum and see heteronormativity as something that is wrong, while more conservative mindsets still very much believe in heteronormativity, and guys should be guys, girls should be girls, and there's nothing in between, and because it very much connects to religion as well with these ideas. And of course, social media is a tool as well, especially now today. People are using social media to protest with gay rights protests, trans rights protests, etc. And as well as the polar side where people are enforcing the heteronormative, where they're like, oh, men should act like men, women should act like women, God says you can only do this, if you do this you're wrong, you're going to go to hell, and stuff like that. And then of course there is that intersectionality layers within the heteronormative. To begin, we'll cover mainly the gender aspect. So, after World War II, the heteronormative was used to suppress women and to keep them within the home, because they were supposed to be the housewife. They were supposed to cook and clean and take care of the kids. They weren't supposed to go and be the breadwinner. The man was supposed to do that. The man was supposed to do all the work to support his 2.5 kids, as the statistics say. And women were expected to stay home, be the perfect housewife, and obey their husbands, be their piece of property, essentially. And then within that heteronormativity, it enforces that gender binary. Even though there are 3 biological sexes, man, woman, and intersex people, they practice in the medical field that intersex people, they would do surgeries when they're babies to keep one if they realize it, to force them to one side or the other and not allow them to make their decision when they're older. And it very much supported the ideas of the masculine man and the feminine woman. So women had to act feminine and men had to act masculine. And if you were outside of that or in between that, showed some traits of both sides, you were seen as different and wrong, and sometimes even sinful according to the Bible, depending if you were as well practicing homosexual activities. And then some people still believe this ideology, like I said, more the conservative sides of folks, because they like to follow the religious aspects, and the heteronormativity is very much supports religious ideology with Christians, because you see men should be men, you can't be gay according to the Bible, even though that is very much just written in there because people wanted to further push this heteronormative. And of course there's the intersectionality with race. So the ideology of the housewife being at home and the husband working was very much mainly for white people, specifically white class people, but I'm only covering the race aspect, because if I go into classism as well as everything else, we will be here all day. That this ideology was very much pushed for middle white class people. So African Americans were still segregated. People were still segregated from white people. If you're a person of color, you are not going to be able to have this middle class white family housewife. Some people did. Some people of color did, but it was very rare. So even then, segregation was still around in the 1960s. So this was right after World War II. People still like that. And then even then, we still have systematic racism within our healthcare systems, workforce, etc., and things like that. Like within that, of course, the gender aspects, women get paid less than men, and of course, if you were a black woman, you would get paid even less than a white woman. And there's all these intersectional aspects within that. And then, of course, World War II featured us fighting the Japanese. So during World War II, many Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. And then after the internment camps, a lot of Americans, a lot of people just look at people and assume their race. They're like, oh, all Asians are Japanese, so they're all bad. So there was very much this racist ideology against Asian people after World War II, pushing that heteronormativity, and especially because of that discrimination, Asian people refused jobs and stuff like that. And within the Asian community, of course, there's their own beliefs. Like, I'm Asian myself, and specifically Chinese, so there's very much that respect for your elders. You have to act a certain way, and along with that, I'm also Catholic, so I've very much been enforced with that heteronormative. With me being queer and Asian, I very much see the heteronormative in my life in a lot of ways. And of course, the heteronormative was just another way to keep white people on top, specifically white men, because women and men had to dress and act a certain way, but women had to keep their hair in certain styles. The African American people and other races have very different texture hairstyles, and because of that, they were still seen as different, even if they tried to conform to these heteronormative ideas. Even if they tried, they couldn't because of this color of their skin or their ethnic features and stuff like that. They were still very much discriminated with this heteronormative ideas pushing for the white ideology, heterosexual ideology, and the patriarchal ideology. And of course, there are many groups that are fighting against the heteronormative. These are just a few. The LGBT plus groups are fighting through the sexuality aspect, feminist groups are fighting the gender aspects, the groups against racism fighting the racism aspects, and of course I did mention I included some of the contact information on the infographic. And then there's sociology careers. Mainly, I put vague answers for education politics because there is so much you can do, especially with education. You can be teaching from a young age for kids all the way up to college and teaching these ideas of equality and pushing that heteronormativity and treating people truly as equals, that not everyone's different. Because even within the heteronormativity, there's also ableism as well that I did not cover. Because, like I said, if I covered everything, we'll be here all day. The ableism people who are disabled, would definitely not be able to do as much. Like, for example, if you were a paraplegic, you wouldn't be able to get a quality job and support these heteronormative ideas, even if you wanted to, even if you saw these as right and wanted to perform. And then within that, there's classism as well as other things. And then other careers are politics. You can be a political advisor, be an actual politician and stuff like that, plan committees and stuff like that in order to combat heteronormativity. You can start one of these groups, for example. You can work with these groups and other groups as well in order to combat the heteronormativity within our society. And these are all my references, and then this is my inquiry prompt. How can society fight heteronormativity, and how can you as an individual fight it? So it's basically two questions in one. Like, how can society as a whole come together to push these toxic ideologies away? How do we get rid of this gender binary? How do we stop seeing race as a defining feature? How do we stop seeing sexuality as a defining feature? How do we get rid of gender roles? How do we make it okay for people to just be themselves and not conform to these heteronormative ideas? And then how can you as an individual, because we all were raised with implicit bias to see things like up until now, like even when we were kids, we still had some problems with heteronormativity because our parents, they might not have known better. Education back then wasn't as good as it is now. It wasn't as woke as it is now, not teaching people to be more mindful of each other and stuff like that. So overall, just how can we as a society and how can you as an individual fight that heteronormativity?